Hi, my name is Matt Story, and this is my presentation on the rhetorical analysis of the field of psychology. I decided to do this video in more of a lecture format to give a more human element to this discussion rather than, some sort of video with more writing and words over the top of it, because the field of psychology is very human in nature, but the writing can seem more cold and cut off than people, might think at first glance. So I want to bring more of a human element and put a face to the voice that's explaining all this. So brief background on psychology in general. People have been thinking about the way that the mind works for pretty much as long as we have been here. Various thinkers, philosophers, and scholars throughout the ages have had very different ideas about how the mind works and its nature, particularly in the for most of human history. Psychology was more seen as a subset of religion or philosophical thinking and was very mysterious. And we thought that the mind was kind of divine or intangible and that it was very mysterious. When the first psychological research lab that started examining the mind using replicatable studies and using statistical analysis of the results to found its principles in Germany in 1879 by Wilhelm Wundt, everything changed. The scientific approach to psychology took over and spread like wildfire, and within 10 years, 20 years, it had really taken over the entire conversation when we talk about discovering more about the way that humans think. And during this time, various people were writing in different ways. And after a while, it was getting more difficult as more and more branches of psychology were springing up for people to understand one another. So the American Psychological Association created the APA format, which is what psychology uses today and is really the backbone of how we write about psychology. And it did this with two main goals in mind: to increase consistency between writings and transparency of the material. And now we're going to dive a little bit more into the actual style, which makes up a lot of how we write about psychology. It provides a lot of specific rules and backbone. There's plenty of liberty for organization and formatting of how you say it, but there are a lot of the way that you see the language presented is very consistent. It's because of the APA format, and is very effective. And it's so effective that many other scientific disciplines have taken to use APA format in their own. Some of the some tangible rules that are in APA format are using gender neutral pronouns when referring to people, unless gender is specifically relevant to the topic at hand. So if you're just studying a population and you talk about a specific subject, you would want to say that they did this. Unless you're studying only women, and it's important that you're only studying women because it's a study about women, then you could say she. But for the most part, you want to just eliminate that bias altogether by using they. If you cite previous work that you've done, you want to cite yourself like any other author. You don't want to give yourself any special treatment. Authors in a work are listed alphabetically, so nobody has to fight over whose name is first, whose name is last. Remove that kind of bias. And identity is reduced to the most generic terms possible whenever you need to. Oftentimes you'll see the various researchers involved in a paper, although they do different roles and have different titles outside, in their departments, they'll just be collectively referred to as researchers so that the interpretation of the methods is not biased by knowing whatever prestige or title goes along with other ways that you could describe these individuals. The next biggest thing that you're going to need to know about psychological writing is that it relies very heavily on referencing statistics and previous works. You'll see citations pretty much anytime there's a hard argument being made. You'll see a citation to another study or to the results of that study. And this can actually be a treasure trove, because if you go to the end of the work, there's a list of all of the articles that have been referenced, and you can use those to further in your understanding of topics and tangential topics. And it's very easy to start getting out into a web where you can increase your knowledge a lot on a particular field or topic because of this. The statistics involved in psychology can be difficult to understand, for sure. There's a baseline knowledge of statistics you're going to need, but this is very useful because anytime a claim is being made about the research, they will tell you straight up what part of the evidence supports this claim, so that when they are making a claim, it's made with authority and it's not somebody's opinion. well, it's an interpretation, but it's not just purely opinion. It has a empirical referent, which is what makes it science. The language itself has a lot of specific language to psychology, and they kind of just expect you to know this already when you go in to read a psychological work, piece of literature. For example, in common vocabulary, the words mood, emotion, and feeling are more or less interchangeable when we talk about your mental state. In psychology, though, they have very different meanings and they're specific. Emotion refers to an innate universal response of sensation that we have in reaction to outside stimuli. Meanwhile, you would describe your emotional state throughout the day in a short-term way, how you're feeling lately, you could say as affect. And, we don't use those kinds of things in normal speech. So you have to have a bit of an understanding of psychology to really get what the literature is getting at. However, past that, the language between the different specific domains of psychology is reduced down so that you can understand, cognitive psychology if you work in clinical or something like that. For example, if I were to say, this study examined responses in the anterior cingulate cortex. You're not going to know what I'm talking about because I don't study the anterior cingulate cortex. I don't have pictures of brains up in my office and things like that. What I might be able to understand, though, is an article would say something more along the lines of, this study examined responses in the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, an area of the brain that is associated with directed attention and impulse control. And then they would probably have a citation after that. That's a lot more easy to understand because we're just seeing what is going on in simple and plain terms. And that's one of the hallmarks of how psychology discusses its findings. The style of writing and the sentence format is also something that's rather regulated, and it is optimized specifically for you to be able to understand the reading easiest. Complex sentence structure and different tiered paragraphs and indentations, all of that is reduced. It's very standardized. And this is to make it so that you don't have to use your brain power thinking about how it's written down. You just want to be able to think about what is being said. This is to boost reader comprehension and to make it accessible to more people who might not have as strong language skills, and to make sure that everybody is getting the same idea out of what is being said. The information is conveyed in a very transparent way. It's very important. So complex sentence structure should be replaced by shorter or simpler sentences whenever possible. Sometimes it's not quite possible and can be a little complex, but it's about doing it to the best of your ability. And that leaves some liberty for you to change up how you write. Although there are these rules in place, you can see that there's a lot of room to put in your own personal interpretation and style into your papers. It's not just, rigid, fill out a form and read that. There is still art to it. Metaphors are used only sparingly and only really when needed. Like you could describe one area's brain as a switch for turning on and off something else if that helps the reader understand a complex interaction between these two things. But you really only want to do that when absolutely necessary. Things like figurative language and poetic wording, descriptive imagery, are just a no-go. We don't want those kinds of things in there. And it's not because psychologists hate fun or beautiful poetry or reading or anything like that. It's because a lot of the concepts in psychology are very complex and they have nuance to them that give them a unique identity. So we don't want you to think about imagery that is similar because you're going to get in your mind that imagery that's similar. We want you to get in your mind the actual thing that we're trying to convey. And by eliminating figurative language and poetic liberties, it's a lot easier to get a more objective, spot-on description of a topic. Even though it might be a little bit harder to write about that way, that burden is on the writer to make sure that they're communicating in a way that's understandable. In many other disciplines, there's a wrap-up that concludes the end of the paper and kind of goes over what's talked about before. In psychological writings, it's interesting that it's actually done at the beginning, and it's called the abstract, and it gives a very brief overview of every other section in the writing to give you a good idea of the whole thing. And I personally like this a lot because what you can do is you can look at that abstract, you can see what they're going to talk about and whether or not it's worth your time to go in and dive. These readings can be difficult and they can be long, and getting an idea of what you're getting into before you start reading it is extremely helpful. Also, some people might not have the background knowledge necessary to read the entire paper, but they can get the broad strokes from reading the abstract, which are generally pretty simple. Also, if you go down to the references section and you are going and looking at other works, you can read the abstract of that other work to see if it's really on the same kind of field of information that you were looking for. And it can make it so that you can check out 3, 4, 5 articles, read their abstracts, and see which one you really want to dive into in the same amount of time it would take you to just read one. But because of this, there's not really a wrap up at the end. If you need a wrap up at the end to kind of go over everything that was discussed, you're going to need to jump back to the abstract and give that another read through. Also, headings and subheadings serve as the bulk of the transitions from one area of the text to another. So there aren't really transition sentences saying next we're going to discuss the methods used in this research. There will just be a line break and it'll say methods. And this is good because it makes the writing very concise. We're not putting anything extra in there that doesn't need to be. And transitions generally tend to lend themselves to more figurative writing and, less objectivity and kind of, what other disciplines would consider to be very good writing. But in psychological writing, we really just want to have it nice, clear cut from one topic to another so we can make it clear what's being discussed. So it can make it a little bit seem cold or abrupt transitions. However, another great thing about this is that you can use it to go directly into what you need to know. If you're already familiar with the results, you can go straight to the methods section and you can read everything there and you'll be able to see how the research was conducted. If you're just worried about the implications of these findings, you can go to the discussion section where that's done. If you're going back to the paper and you need to cite something from it, it's very easy to find what was being discussed because they're all in very clear-cut sections. And this is done through a standardized use of headings and subheadings. And like I said, a lot less transitions from one topic to another. Okay. The results of the subjects are going to be listed in tables and graphs, and there's going to be a lot of statistics, as I mentioned earlier. And there may be extra things added in what are called appendixes or appendices at the end, and they could be samples of surveys that are given out, more complex or exhaustive findings that have been done, and those usually get tacked on to the very end. The results of all of this standardization and strange kind of rules and very plain, simple writing is that one paper to another is extremely consistent. You can see the information being broken down into similar ways from one study to another, and it makes it very easy to go in and extract what you need from each individual paper. And it can make it once you get the hang of it, it's very easy to follow each individual paper's flow because they're all very similar. Because the language is simple and accessible to different branches of psychology, collaboration is much easier because the findings from each individual study are applicable to a wider audience, which can lead to collaborative research in the future. It can lead to just a better understanding of certain topics overall, and it can lead to people just disseminating the knowledge that they find across a wider audience, which in the end of everything is really the end goal of science. It doesn't matter if you can derive everything from a great experiment. You're the only person who knows it. It doesn't matter unless you're able to share that information with your peers and with everybody else too. And now that brings us to some of the drawbacks of this. As we stated, there are some bars that you have to meet to be able to understand this. So some of the psychological reading is kind of gatekept from the rest of the world. In all honesty, if you don't really have a background in psychology, it's going to be a bit difficult for you to get past more than the abstract. If you haven't taken statistics and you don't know what a p-value is, it's going to be hard for you to look at those stats and understand why they're significant at all. It's still professional writing and it is still complicated, but among the sciences, it's one of the most approachable, which is what it is. Another thing about psychological writing, although it takes many strides, as we discussed earlier, to reduce bias from gender and race and prestige in the individuals themselves, there still exists bias. If the writer has implicit assumptions they make when they write, it's going to be reflected there. If there are assumptions that you're making or your perspective is skewed by your cultural background, that's still going to exist in the paper because it's not something that's said explicitly. And this can be kind of problematic because the next generation that goes to read these papers, it might assume that they are pretty free of bias since there aren't comparative or evaluative statements that are rooted in opinion. And, those kind of like harder to identify biases might be passed down to the next reader. So it is still good to keep a critical eye and think about diverse populations when reviewing psychological research. Um, Overall, the field of psychology is doing pretty well. It's a younger science, as we discussed. It's not even 200 years old, which is pretty insane to think about. The ancient Greeks were making strides in geometry. That was thousands of years ago. And psychology is, going through some teething problems, as you might call them. There are a lot of old ideas that are having a hard time being cast off that still appear in the popular discourse within non-professionals, for example, and professionals too, honestly. Sigmund Freud is maybe one of the most well-known psychologists of all time, and almost every single contemporary psychologist worth his salt is going to decry almost everything he said. His teachings are not taught. They're taught for the sake of history and for context, and they're taught to be disproven because they still exist so strong in our common consciousness, despite all the work that's been done to overturn what has been said. And it's not just Freud. There are plenty of psychological concepts and misconceptions that are still rife in the world, and part of this is because of the emergence of pop psychology. People who will claim to know things or that certain foods are better for your mental health and all these things, who seem like they're authoritative resources, but they're really not. And it's also difficult because pop psychology is, on the other hand of that, can be psychology's best friend, because we're taking this very complicated discourse that has these high bars to meet, and we want to make it accessible to everybody. And that's essentially what pop psychology is. But separating the good from the bad is very difficult to the average reader who doesn't have any sort of background in this. So something to consider, something we'll work on. We're hoping that more people in psychological disciplines are putting out materials that are digestible to the average person and not just for the other professionals. And another thing is sometimes findings can go on deaf ears. There have been many studies. I did a meta-analysis on this that show that gay and lesbian parents are great at parenting children. They're no better or worse than heterosexual couples. And yet there's still fierce debate about whether or not that's true, even though it's been proven time and time after again in rigorous scientific study. So sometimes the implications of psychological findings, they go on deaf ears, and that impacts the public discourse and it impacts the academic discourse, because what people want to know is what is going to be researched. We would have stopped proving it 3 or 4 studies, but because people still debate this topic, there's still research being done on it. And that collective discussion impacts the professional discussion in quite a profound way. So that's another thing to consider. Finally, psychological discourse and research is lacking in an incredible way of diversity and different cultures. The American Psychological Association is the largest publisher of psychological information in the world. They're kind of the big dog, so to say, and they only accept work from American authors or individuals collaborating with American authors, which inherently shuts down a diversity from the whole world. If you want to study the human mind, you're leaving out billions of people if you only accept people from America to publish their findings. Cross-cultural psychology is absolutely fascinating and really has not even been explored for more than 70 years at this point. It was really only in the 80s that cross-cultural research started to be done in a real way. And that is an area that really should be explored more in psychology. Overall, the discourse surrounding psychology does have some moderate bars to meet if you want to participate in the discussion in an academic way. But once you do, the wealth of information available to you is incredible. And you should be able to research topics very easily because of the extremely consistent way that papers are formatted, the simple language used, the optimization for reading comprehension, and clear results that back up claims. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out in the comments below, and have a great rest of your day.